The man who might soon control one of the most consequential governments in the Middle East is someone most people outside of Iran have never heard of. He moves quietly, avoids cameras, and has spent decades building influence behind the walls of Qom's most guarded seminaries. His name is Mojtaba Khamenei, and the United States government recently announced a $10 million reward for information about his whereabouts. $10 million is the same scale of reward the U.S. has historically offered for information on individuals connected to terrorism and organized crime. This is not a routine diplomatic measure. It is not a press release designed to check a policy box. It signals that American intelligence considers this man a figure of serious strategic interest, someone worth extraordinary resources simply to locate and understand. When governments start paying that kind of money just to know where someone sleeps at night, it tells you something important about how they assess the threat landscape. But the money is only the beginning of the story. To understand why this reward exists, why these particular names are attached to it, and why it matters beyond the immediate headlines, you have to go back further. You have to understand the system these men were built by, the history that shaped them, and the moment Iran now finds itself in, a moment that most analysts who watch the country closely describe as the most uncertain and potentially volatile in decades. So, let us start at the beginning. Iran's Islamic Republic was established in 1979, following a revolution that overthrew Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, a monarch backed by the United States. The revolution was led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who returned from exile in Paris to become the founding supreme leader of a new theocratic state. The system he designed was unlike anything else in the modern world. It combined elements of parliamentary democracy with religious governance in a structure where ultimate authority rested not with elected officials, but with a senior cleric deemed qualified to interpret and apply Islamic law. When Khomeini died in 1989, the system faced its first succession crisis. The man chosen to replace him was Ali Khamenei, who at the time held a lower clerical rank than the position traditionally required. His selection was controversial within the clerical establishment, but it was ratified by the Assembly of Experts, the body of senior religious scholars empowered to make that choice. Khamenei has held this position ever since for more than 35 years, gradually consolidating power, placing loyalists in key institutions, and building the kind of accumulated authority that comes from decades of institutional control. He is now 84 years old. Reports about his health have circulated for years, with some accounts describing serious medical conditions and others suggesting those reports are exaggerated. What is not in dispute is that he is aging, that he will not hold this position indefinitely, and that the question of succession has moved from a theoretical future concern to an active present reality inside Iranian political circles. That question is the most consequential domestic political issue in Iran today. It is consequential not just for Iranians, but for everyone who has an interest in what Iran does next. What Iran does next involves a nuclear program that has never been closer to weapons capability, a regional military presence that extends from Lebanon to Yemen to Iraq, and a set of ideological commitments that have defined the country's foreign policy for 4.5 decades. Into this picture steps Mojtaba Khamenei. He was born in 1969, the Supreme Leader's second son. He studied in Qom, earning the religious rank of Hojatul Islam. He has never held a formal public office. He has not given widely circulated speeches or appeared regularly in state media. Photographs of him are difficult to find. In a political culture where public visibility is often a tool of ambition, his sustained absence from the public eye has itself become one of the most analyzed aspects of his profile. But absence from public view is not the same as absence from power. Behind the scenes, Mojtaba has been connected to the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, for decades. Understanding what that organization actually is matters enormously here because the IRGC is not simply a military branch in the conventional sense. The IRGC was created specifically to protect the Islamic Revolution and its ideology, distinct from the regular armed forces that protect the state's territorial integrity. Over time, it has grown into something far larger than its original mandate. It controls significant portions of Iran's economy through a vast network of affiliated companies and construction conglomerates. It runs its own intelligence operations, separate from the formal Ministry of Intelligence. It manages Iran's ballistic missile program and its relationships with proxy and partner forces across the region. It has its own political interests and its own institutional culture. In many respects, the IRGC is the backbone of the Islamic Republic, the force that, more than any other single institution, determines whether the system holds together during moments of stress. Whoever becomes the next supreme leader will need the IRGC either solidly behind them or, at a minimum, not actively opposed. That is simply the arithmetic of power in the Iranian system. And Mojtaba Khamenei, whatever else might be said about him, has spent years cultivating exactly those relationships. The clearest public evidence of his political orientation came in 2009. That year, millions of Iranians took to the streets following a presidential election whose results were widely disputed. The Green Movement, as it came to be known, was the largest domestic challenge the Islamic Republic had faced since its founding. Protesters called for the annulment of results they believed had been manipulated and for broader political change. The streets of Tehran and other major cities filled with demonstrations that the government found deeply threatening. The response was a crackdown. The IRGC and its Basijah paramilitary units moved against protesters. People were arrested, beaten, and in documented cases, killed. Journalists were detained. Civil society organizations were pressured. Over the months that followed, the movement was suppressed through sustained coercive force. Human rights organizations documented abuses at detention facilities. International governments condemned the response. The scale and systematic nature of the suppression made it one of the most significant episodes of state violence against Iranian citizens in the post-revolutionary period. Multiple analysts and sources with knowledge of the Iranian system's inner workings have described Mujtaba as having played a meaningful role in how the leadership responded to those protests, in the decision to suppress rather than accommodate. The U.S. Treasury Department reached its own conclusions and formally sanctioned him in 2019, citing his involvement in the events of that period alongside broader human rights concerns. A sanctions designation and a $10 million intelligence reward are different instruments. The sanction says, "We have determined you did something we condemn, and we are restricting your access to the international financial system." The reward says, "We need to know where you are and what you're doing because we believe it has direct bearing on our national security." The latter is a more urgent and more operational kind of concern. Now, let us talk about Ali Larijani because his inclusion in this reward program is significant and tells us something about what American intelligence is actually trying to map. Larijani is one of the most sophisticated political operators in the history of the Islamic Republic. He served as Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council. He was Iran's chief nuclear negotiator during the critical years of the mid-2000s when the international community was attempting to use diplomacy to slow Iran's enrichment program. He served as Speaker of Parliament for a full decade. He comes from one of the most powerful clerical families in Iran. His brothers have held senior positions in the judiciary and in government. He himself has managed to remain relevant through multiple presidential administrations, multiple shifts in political winds, and multiple generations of Iranian leadership. What makes Larijani particularly interesting from a strategic standpoint is his time as nuclear negotiator. During those years, Iran was engaged in sustained international discussions, including negotiations with European powers and eventually within broader multilateral frameworks. Those talks kept diplomatic channels open and, crucially, kept the most severe forms of international pressure from being applied at certain critical moments. At the same time, Iran's nuclear program continued to advance technically. Whether that reflects a deliberate strategy of using diplomacy as a shield for technical progress, or simply the reality that sovereign states pursue their national interests simultaneously on multiple tracks, the outcome is factual and measurable. Iran's enrichment capabilities when those negotiations concluded were substantially greater than when they began. Larijani no longer holds a formal title in the government, but that framing misses how Iranian power actually works. Formal titles matter less than relationships, access, and accumulated institutional knowledge. Men who have spent decades at the center of Iranian strategic decision-making do not retire into irrelevance. They become the advisors whose calls get returned, the back-channel operators whose participation in sensitive processes can be plausibly denied, and the figures who are consulted precisely because they know where things are buried. The U.S. interest in Larijani's current whereabouts and activities reflects an assessment that he remains a live node in Iran's strategic network, not a historical figure. Major General Yahya Rahim Safavi commanded the IRGC from 1997 to 2007, which means he led the organization through one of its most consequential decades of expansion. During those years, the IRGC's relationships with armed groups across the region were deepened and systematized. The infrastructure of what we now call the Axis of Resistance, the network of Iranian-aligned forces stretching from Hezbollah in Lebanon through various Iraqi factions to the Houthis in Yemen, was substantially built out during the period of Safavi's command. He has spoken publicly about strategic concepts that help explain Iran's regional behavior. The idea that Iran is better served by projecting its security concerns outward, by engaging potential adversaries at a distance rather than allowing threats to reach Iranian territory, is a doctrine that has shaped everything from the deployment of IRGC advisors in Syria, to the provision of precision missile technology, to Hezbollah, to the training of militia forces in Iraq. This is not simply a military strategy. It is a political and ideological framework that has become deeply embedded in how the IRGC understands its mission. After leaving command of the IRGC, Safavi moved into a direct advisory role to the Supreme Leader. That transition is significant. It means his thinking and his recommendations have had a sustained and proximate influence on the highest level of Iranian decision-making for nearly 2 decades. He is not a retired general whose views are historically interesting. He is an active participant in shaping how Iran's leadership thinks about security and strategy. When you put these 3 figures together, Mojtaba Khamenei, Ali Larijani, and Yahya Rahim Safavi, you can see the outline of what American intelligence is actually trying to understand. This is not a random collection of sanctioned individuals. These are people embedded at different points in the network of Iranian power during a moment of maximum strategic uncertainty. The succession question, the nuclear program, the regional military posture, and the response to external pressure, all of these are connected, and all of them run through people like these. Iran's nuclear program deserves particular attention here because it provides the sharpest context for why the succession question has moved from significant to potentially critical. Iran is currently enriching uranium to roughly 60% purity. For context, civilian nuclear power programs typically use fuel enriched to between 3 and 5%. Medical research reactors use material enriched to around 20%. Weapons-grade material requires enrichment to approximately 90%. Iran is not at 90%, but the distance between 60% and 90% in purely technical terms is not the largest step in the enrichment process. The infrastructure required to reach 60% is the hard part. Going further is, from a purely technical standpoint, a matter of operational decision rather than capability development. Multiple non-proliferation analysts have described Iran's current position as threshold status, meaning the country has the technical knowledge, the centrifuge infrastructure, and the enriched material to produce weapons-grade uranium in a period measured in days if a political decision were made to do so. That political decision has not, as far as outside observers can determine with confidence, been made. The Iranian government maintains that its nuclear program is entirely civilian in nature. The International Atomic Energy Agency has documented that Iran has not provided satisfactory explanations for certain findings at undeclared sites, which has created ongoing uncertainty about the full scope of the program. What this means in practical terms is that Iran's nuclear status is essentially a political question right now, not a technical one. The technical capability is present. What separates Iran from a nuclear-armed state, if that assessment is accurate, is a decision by the political leadership. And the political leadership is in the process of a generational transition whose outcome is unknown. A new supreme leader consolidating power in a system that rewards demonstrated strength, facing external pressure from the United States and Israel with a nuclear program at threshold status, is a scenario that concentrates the minds of security planners around the world. It is not a scenario that allows for comfortable assumptions about how things will unfold. The reward program needs to be understood in that context. $10 million for information on the whereabouts of figures like Mojtaba Khamenei is, at one level, a straightforward intelligence operation. The United States would benefit from better information about the movements, communications, and decision-making of people who are likely to shape Iran's next chapter. That information has operational value for contingency planning, for diplomatic strategy, and for understanding red lines and intentions. At another level, it is a signal. Publishing the reward publicly tells potential sources inside Iran, in the diaspora, or in third countries with relevant intelligence that this information is being actively sought, and that the United States is prepared to invest significantly in obtaining it. It creates incentives for people who might have relevant information to come forward or to make contact. It is also, whether intended or not, a psychological instrument. Knowing that your location has been publicly assigned a $10 million value changes the environment around you. The most loyal security apparatus in the world is made up of human beings. And human beings have financial pressures, ideological doubts, personal grievances, and relationships that create vulnerabilities. The bounty does not require those vulnerabilities to exist, but it makes anyone who knows about it aware that if such vulnerabilities did exist, they could be extremely consequential. There are important limits to this kind of pressure, and they deserve honest acknowledgement. The Islamic Republic has operated under American sanctions and diplomatic pressure for over 4 decades. It has survived an 8-year war with Iraq that cost an estimated 500,000 Iranian lives. It has survived the death of its founding leader, international isolation, severe economic contractions, and multiple serious waves of domestic unrest. The system has proven its capacity to endure external pressure repeatedly. Assuming that a reward program, however large, will fundamentally alter internal Iranian dynamics would be a significant overestimation of its likely impact. The succession will be determined by Iranian internal politics, by their relationships and coalitions that have been built within the clerical establishment and the IRGC over years and decades, and by whoever has positioned themselves most effectively within those structures. That process is largely opaque to outside observers, which is precisely why the United States is willing to pay $10 million to reduce that opacity even marginally. What the succession ultimately produces, whether a figure oriented toward consolidation and stability or one oriented toward confrontation and assertion, will have consequences that extend well beyond Iran's borders. It will shape decisions about the nuclear program at a moment when those decisions have never carried more weight. It will shape the posture of Iran's regional network at a time when that network is more capable than at any previous point in its history. It will shape how Iran navigates its relationships with Russia and China, both of which have deepened their engagement with Tehran in recent years. It will shape whether there is any path toward diplomatic engagement with the West, or whether the ideological commitments of the new leadership foreclose that possibility entirely. These are not abstract geopolitical considerations. These are questions with direct implications for regional stability, for the safety of American personnel and allies in the Middle East, for global energy markets, and for the broader international order's capacity to manage nuclear proliferation. The reason $10 million is being offered for information about where certain Iranians are located is that the people making that offer have concluded that the answers to those questions may depend in significant part on understanding exactly who those Iranians are, what they are doing, and what they intend. That calculation may or may not prove correct. Intelligence is always uncertain. Strategy always involves assumptions that can fail. But the judgment embedded in this reward program reflects an assessment that we are approaching a decision point in Iranian history, that the decisions made at that point will matter enormously, and that the United States currently knows less than it would like about the people who will make them. The names on that reward list are not symbols. They are individuals at specific locations, having specific conversations, making specific plans. The $10 million question is what those plans are.